it's me, good sister girl Holly, and welcome back to my channel. Today I have a pretty interesting video. I don't know if you guys will like it. Fingers crossed that you guys will. So this one is going to be an interesting video. I want to start a series. Hopefully you guys will like it. But I want to start a series, strangest unsolved mysteries from each state in alphabetical order. So I know I'm not from America, so I don't know if this gives me the right to speak about this. If you know anything about any of these cases, also could encourage you to go to someone about it, go to the police. The first unsolved mystery is Alabama, I don't really know how to say it. So this is the unsolved mystery of Chad Langford. So this is who Chad Langford was. 20-year-old Chad Langford was an SPC military police officer at the Redstone Arsenal near Huntsville, Alabama. He was found close to death outside the police unit on March 12, 1992. At around 7:40 p.m, he radioed to his dispatch that he required assistance due to a violent motorist who had stopped to help him. When officers arrived to help immediately, they came upon his MP armband, portable radio, and military ID card arranged in the middle of the road. About a quarter mile down the road, an officer found Chad outside of his patrol car. His cap had been stuffed in his mouth, and he had the lanyard from his handgun wrapped around his ankles, handcuffs on his left wrists, the date March 3rd, and the name Robert written on his hand. The unit's radar cable wrapped around his neck, and his .45 caliber gun beneath his left shoulder. He was shot in the head and barely alive. He was rushed to hospital, where he succumbed to his injury a few hours later. The army ruled Chad's death a suicide, who had rejected the idea that he had killed himself. Jim claimed that in February 1992, Chad told him that he was doing undercover drug-related army work and had received several death threats. He did not know where they were coming from. Within less than 14 days, he would end up dead. The army reviewed this case for 4 months and claimed that he was not involved in any undercover work, but he did have several psychological problems. He was depressed and suicidal before his death. The army also claimed that his recent breakup was a motive he had to kill himself. However, his ex-girlfriend Roxanne claimed that he had broke up with her, that the breakup was his idea and he would have likely been happier about it. She said that he broke up with her because he was focused on his work and knew he could not dedicate enough time to spend with her. Roxanne believed that someone had influenced Chad to break up with her to keep her safe and away from whatever unsafe doing he was connected to. Some believed that Chad's change in behaviour was related to a CID botched robbery. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, I'm sorry. He had told others involved that he planned to have someone shoot him while wearing a bulletproof vest. Before his death, Chad called several of his friends, no relatives, and said goodbye to them. His relatives believed that he would have called them to say goodbye if he wanted to commit suicide. Chad's relatives believed that he was at the part of the base to meet someone about his undercover work. They believed that at least whom he knew shot and killed him to silence about his secret drug-related work. So guys, that is the first unsolved mystery. So this one is Alaska's worst mass murder. The gruesome tale happened near the small southeastern Alaska town of Craig. It might be difficult to understand why and how such a murder could happen, and more importantly, how no one seemed to know who the murder was. So on Sunday, September 5th, 1982, the investor, a 58-feet Purse Cena owned by Mark Colthurst from Blaine, Washington, pulled into Craig, Alaska, and unloaded its recent catch of 77,000 pounds of pink salmon onto Holbrook Seafoods of Tender. The catch from just a few days of fishing was worth $33,000. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game had temporarily closed the commercial salmon season, but planned to reopen it the following day for the final salmon opening of 1982. Besides Mark Colthurst, the crew and passengers on the Investor included Mark's wife, Irene, 28, their 2 children, Kimberly, 5, and John, 4, Mark's cousin, Mike Stewart, 19, Dean Moon, 19, Jerome Keown, 19, and Chris Heyman, 18. Irene was 3 months pregnant After unloading its catch, the Investor pulled up to the North Cove dock in Craig, and the crew tied the boat outside the Senior Decade, which was in turn tied outside the Senior Defiant. The Defiant was tied to the dock. To get back and forth to the dock, the crew from the Investor had to climb across the decks of the two boats. Moon and Keown went ashore soon after the boat docked. According to troopers, the two men later bought a small quantity of drugs from a friend named John Kenneth Pill. Pill had been a crewman of Mark Colthurst on a previous boat, but he was now crewing for someone else. While on shore, Jerome Keown placed the call to his brother, and his brother later stated Jerome sounded normal and didn't indicate anything was wrong. Stewart and Heyman left the boat together, but the troopers could find no one in Craig who remembered seeing the two men that night. Stewart called his home in Bellingham, Washington, and didn't mention any sign of the trouble. Mark Colthurst apparently had no cash on the boat because he wrote an $100 check to a friend for cash, so he could take his family out to dinner at Ruth's Ann's. It was a restaurant in Craig to celebrate his 28th birthday. People at the restaurant later reported nothing unusual happened, but one witness said John Kenneth Pill briefly stopped at the family's table to talk to them. Pill later denied he was ever at the restaurant. The Colthursts left the restaurant at approximately 9:30 p.m, and a crewman on the Decade remembered 4-year-old John sticking his head inside the pilot house to say hi on the way back to the Investor. During the night, a storm with high winds and heavy seas pounded the dock, and the crew of the Decade celebrated the end of the salmon season with a loud party. With all that noise, no one in the Decade or Defiance heard anything unusual, and no one on either boat remembered anyone coming or going to the Investor. Remember, anyone going to the Investor from the dock had to climb across the decks for the other two boats. At 6 a.m. on Monday morning, a Decade crewman went out on deck and saw the Investor slowly idling away from the dock. He noticed the crew of the Investor had inexplicably left their expensive tie-down lines on the deck of the Decade. Normally the crew would retrieve these lines and stow them on board until they were needed again. The Decade's crewman waved at a man on the Investor pilot house, and the man returned the wave. A few minutes later, the Decade's skipper also came out on deck and saw a man of the deck on the Investor. At 7:30 a.m, a crewman on another steamer saw the Investor anchored across the harbour from Craig, near Fish Egg Island. Around the same time, another witness saw the skiff throw the Investor tried to the cold storage dock in Craig. By 10:30 a.m, heavy fog rolled into Craig, obscuring the Investor from everyone in Craig. As the fishing fleet prepared for the salmon opening later in the day, the Investor was forgotten for the moment. The Investor's skiff, however, was in the way at the cold storage dock and had to be moved several times during the day. The captain of the Decade thought the Investor left the dock because of the loud party on his boat, and he radioed the Investor to apologise. There was no reply. As boats headed out for the salmon opening, the fog remained so thick most captains had to use radar to navigate. Tuesday morning, one day later, the fog finally lifted, and observers in Craig were surprised to see the Investor still anchored near Fish Egg Island. Why didn't Mark Colthurst go fishing with the rest of the fleet? A young man was seen buying 2.5 gallons of gasoline in Craig, and he then climbed into the Investor's skiff with the gasoline and motored out to the Investor. At 4 p.m, the crew of the fishing boat casino noticed smoke rising from the Investor. After alerting authorities, the casino headed towards the Investor to offer help. On the way, the captain of the casino saw the Investor's skiff leave the Investor and motor toward Craig. The captain nearly had to ram the skiff to make it stop, and when he asked if there were people on the burning boat, the skiff operator said, "Yeah, there's people on the boat," and then he sped toward Craig. Once the mysterious man in the Investor's skiff reached the Craig's dock, he spoke to at least 3 people before he walked into town and disappeared with the fog. A state trooper investigator later said the man slipped into a time warp at the end of the dock. By the time the casino reached it, the Investor was fully engulfed in the flames and too hot for the crew of the casino to approach. Alaska State Trooper Bob Anderson was the first law enforcement official to arrive on the scene. No one in Craig had the proper equipment to fight a fire on the water, so the responders issued a mayday call, and nearly 2 hours later, a tug with one small pump arrived and started spraying water on the blaze. The Coast Guard was contacted to airlift additional pumps to the scene. Trooper Anderson returned to Craig and called his sergeant and called his sergeant in Ketchikan, telling him the fire was spreading so quickly he was sure the blaze was arson. His sergeant, I'm not sure if it's sergeant, his sergeant said he would send an arson investigator to the scene. At 7:30 p.m, the tug captain radioed the Coast Guard to tell them the fire was under control. Anderson returned to the Investor and found it burned to the gunnels and listing 20 degrees. He and a few volunteers boarded the wreckage and found the charred human remains of 4 people in what had been the galley of the boat. The remains were later identified as Mark Colthurst, his wife Irene, their daughter Kimberly, and Mark's cousin Mike Stewart. All 4 had multiple gunshot wounds. As soon as the 4 bodies were removed, the fire flared up again and destroyed the rest of the cabin. Anderson returned to Greg, where a police officer told him he had interviewed a witness who saw the suspicious man in the Investor's scene skiff. The witness said the man was 20 or 21 years old, with light brown or blonde hair. He weighed 150 to 160 pounds and was wearing glasses and a baseball cap with a logo on it. Since the man was seated in the skiff, the witness couldn't guess at his height. The following morning, two more law enforcement officials arrived. The fire was still burning, so the troopers finally summoned a helicopter used for fighting forest fires, and it dumped water on the burning boat. The boat was listing badly, so the officers towed it to shore and left it. And oddly, the authorities left the Investor unguarded, allowing anyone to poke around in the wreckage, and the rising tide likely destroyed most of the remaining evidence. Once the arson investigator examined the wreckage, he found more bone fragments. Jerome Keown remains were eventually identified among the fragments, but it was never determined whether the remaining bone fragments belonged to either Chris Hayman or Dean Moon, and no remains of 4-year-old John Colthurst were ever found. Investigators believed his body was completely consumed by the blaze. The investigators did not think the killer was one of the missing crew members, because eyewitnesses were certain the man they saw operating the skiff was not a member of the Investor's crew. Since neither Chris Hayman nor Dean Moon was ever seen again after the fire, they were presumed dead, and the police determined that 8 people had been murdered on the Investor. Okay, so guys, basically those are the 2 murder mystery stories that I'll be doing today. Or also, you can get in touch with me, DM me on my Instagram at xohollyroseXO, and I'll be so happy to, if you have any stories that you want to share that you've just heard of that are famous, or if you have your own personal stories, it can be of anything. It doesn't have to be murder mysteries, it can just be mystery. You can get in touch with me and DM me, and I'll be happy to share them. And you can say I don't have to say your name. It can be completely anonymous if you want. But yeah, so I hope you guys enjoyed this, and if you want more of the series, then, give it a thumbs up, and yeah, see you guys.